Hi and welcome. My name is Stacy Contreras and I'm a senior editor at The World. Thank you for joining us today on this Facebook Live about why young Latinos will be critical to the 2020 US presidential election. The question on many minds is, will they turn out to vote? This is part of a project at The World called Every 30 Seconds. And we called it that because approximately every 30 seconds, a young Latino turns 18 and is eligible to vote in the United States. Definitely an important group. You can follow the project at theworld.org. Joining me live is María Teresa Kumar. She's the president and CEO of Voto Latino, and
Hi,
Mark
Daisy.
Hugo Lopez. He's the director of Hispanic research at the Pew Research Center. Hello and welcome to both of you.
Hi.
Thank you, Daisy.
So we're streaming this conversation live via a Zoom connection. And if you viewers out there have any questions, add them in the comments below and we'll get to as many as we can. So I guess to just get started and have, put things in perspective, Latinos have always been an important group in every presidential election, but there is something different now. What is it about this younger demographic that show us that presidential election campaigns should be paying closer attention to them? And we'll start with Mark.
So when we take a look at the Latino electorate, that is people who are at least 18 years of age and a US citizen, what's striking about the US Latino electorate is how young it is. Half are either millennials or Gen Zers for this coming election. By comparison, only about a third of non-Hispanics are either millennials or Gen Zers among other eligible voters. So I think that distinction is a really important one. But to put it into even more perspective, when you talk about 18 to 29-year-olds, 18 to 29-year-old Hispanic voters make up a third of all Hispanic voters. And 18 to 24s, the youngest group, make up about 20% of Hispanic voters. So how young Latinos engage with the election, this coming election, is going to be very important because they're going to make up not only a large share of the Hispanic vote, but they could potentially make up to 6% of the nation's vote alone just because of their numbers. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind about this upcoming election.
And María Teresa, you hear from these young voters every day.
Well, this is it, Daisy. Voto Latino, we started 15 years ago. We say that this is our quinceañera this year. And one of the reasons we started was we were able to look into the future of when young Latinos were going to age in. If you can imagine, when Voto Latino started 15 years ago, there were basically 30,000 Latinos became of age every single month. Now over 1 million become of age every single year to your 30-second stat. And how do we make sure that we have the infrastructure that we are absorbing these young people into the voting booths? Mark alluded to how many people are going to be eligible to vote for the very first time. 4 million of the 12 million new young people that are going to be able to cast a ballot for the very first time in this presidential election are Latino youth. That's not only exciting, it's an opportunity, but it also makes sure that we have to start explaining to them the political process. Sadly, only 8 out of 50 states require civic education in order to graduate from high school. When 51% of our kids for example, in Texas are young Latinos, and they're not, and oftentimes first generation, and they're not receiving what it means to build our democracy by participating at the booth, the work that Voto Latino and others becomes that much more important. And so not only does Voto Latino do we register young people, but we are also teaching them the nuts and bolts of civic engagement, because we want to make sure that when they cast a ballot that they're informed and they're helping shepherd their families through the process.
And so when we talk about Latinos, we know that it's a multidimensional group. Latinos include Democrats, Republicans, everything in between, maybe none of that, right? Both of you, María Teresa and Mark, have for many years followed the issues that Latinos care about. What is it that the younger Latino voter cares? What do they care about? What are some maybe like 2 issues that are really important to these young voters?
So one of the things that Voto Latino is seeing immediately right before COVID was basically 4 issues, and we were really surprised by them. And they came in order of gun reform, immigration, healthcare, and the environment. And not surprisingly, they are reflective of their cohort, with the exception of immigration being really important to them. Now, in the midst of COVID, we're starting to hear a lot about people really concerned with jobs. Many of these young Latinos are part of the gig economy. They're also witnessing their parents who are found part of the essential workforce, who are not only not receiving a lot of the aid that the federal government is providing, but all of a sudden they also recognize that they are kind of trapped when it comes to their own student loans and loan forgiveness. So coming into this election, I think we're going to start hearing a lot about the Latino community, talking specifically about education and healthcare and the economy.
Mark, you've seen these numbers in your research.
Yeah, that's exactly right. COVID-19 has certainly upended a lot of trends that we were seeing prior to the outbreak. And prior to the outbreak, much of the same as what we had seen among young Latinos and Latinos generally that Maria Teresa just mentioned. But the economy and jobs, which was a big issue for Latinos back in the Great Recession, has now become a big issue for Latinos now. We find, for example, that about 41% of Latinos tell us that they themselves have either lost a job or have had wage loss. And that's from a survey that we just had done recently. And when you take a look at the unemployment rate that the federal government just reported, Hispanics particularly have seen the biggest increase in their unemployment rate to 18.9% in April. And among Hispanic women, that number was over 22%. So when we're talking about the economic impact of the COVID-19 outbreak, Latinos are the ones who are seeing the biggest job loss, biggest wage loss, and having perhaps the biggest effect. It remains to be seen what will happen as we go forward, as the economy reopens, but certainly the economy is likely to be a key issue for Latinos, whether young or old, in the coming election.
And I think part of the reason, as Mark mentioned, is that 20% of the Latinx workforce was left out of the first CARES Act. And that was either because they were a US citizen living with someone undocumented, or they were undocumented themselves. But Daisy, let's not forget, these individuals undocumented individuals pay $27 billion in federal and state taxes, and they were left out in the cold. Close to 15% of small businesses in the Latino community received actual PPP relief for small business loans under the CARES Act. 15%. That's nothing when the Latinos are the largest purveyors of small business. And most of those purveyors are Latinas. So a lot of the issues is going to be very simple. What we heard in the 1992 campaign from Bill Clinton, it's the economy's stupid. How do we get out of this? And how do we make sure that these young Latinos are prepared to enter a safe, healthy middle class? Because as Mark mentioned, we are going to be the second largest generation of young Americans coming into the 21st century.
And Daisy, one thing that I might add to that is that it's also interesting that—
You're going to let us geek out, Daisy.
I'm sorry.
No, I love it.
Daisy, one other thing I was going to mention is that when you take a look at also the timing of this, young Latinos have made up a big part of the growth in the U.S. labor force over the course of the last 10 years, and they're projected to continue to be the majority of growth in the number of workers in the U.S. workforce over the course of the next few years. Now, that's important because they're experiencing the labor market and the workforce for the first time in many cases. And now here we are with another economic crisis, much like the one in the Great Recession, which impacted a whole generation of young Americans. This one may be impacting young Latinos even more so. So that's another important factor I think to keep in mind, is that the timing of this and the relative importance and first-time experiences of young Latinos are being shaped by what's happening now with the COVID-19 crisis.
And because we can't ignore COVID-19, especially this year during a presidential election, is outreach going to have to change dramatically? Maria Teresa, we've talked about this before. How is that outreach changing? Are organizations, grassroots organizations, worried that because of COVID, we're not going to be able to get to this demographic? We're not going to get to the Latinos that remain on the fence about voting?
Right. Well, I think we should preface by saying is that Latinos, when they're registered, we come out and vote. So 16 million of us are registered and 79% of us cast a ballot come November. That has been a historical trend for the last two cycles. The challenge, though, is closing that voter registration gap, where 15 million of us are unregistered. And of that 15 million, 10 million of us are under the age of 33. And one of the ways that Voto Latino has been able to meet the moment is that we do all of our work digitally. That's 99% of our work is through digital communications. We reach roughly about 8.5 million folks a month. And As of today, I know that you and I talked yesterday, the day before, Voto Latino had registered 107,000. As of this morning, we had registered 109,000, right? So the work continues. I think the challenge is that we need more organizations basically just adapting to the challenge. We're not adapting, we are scaling, because we recognize that the only way we take back the White House is to ensure that we increase the pool of eligible voters. And that marketplace happens to coincide with the young Latino who is bearing the brunt of COVID-19, but it's also when you talk to them and you ask them what the solutions are, they have clear understandings because they are on the front lines, they are experiencing this day to day, that they can actually be part of the solution that we need post-COVID as well.
And speaking of strategy and outreach to this young group, is there a strategy or an approach by these campaigns when it comes to courting Latino voters, especially these young Latino voters, that stands out to either one of you? I mean, are you seeing familiar playbooks over the years?
I could speak. I think they're starting to pivot, right? A lot of folks were talking about how Bernie Sanders had such a fantastic inroads with the Latino community, and that is because he was, in many ways, targeting the same people Voto Latino targets, and that is young Latinas. Young Latinas are oftentimes the ones that are navigating the country for their parents long before they turn 18 years old. When it comes to issues of wage parity, sexual reproductive rights, healthcare, education, that hits them square on the shoulders. And so Bernie did a fantastic job of targeting these young people, Latinas in particular, and young influencers, and did a strategy of looking at the map as a whole map versus when primary days were coming. I'm encouraged by the fact that Joe Biden has just brought on Julie Rodriguez. She is a veteran of the White House and a veteran grassroots organizer, incredibly respected. And I think that's going to give them a lot of strength. I still believe that we need to focus again on young Latinas and making sure that they are the ones that are receiving the information they need, because when you target them, you influence not just that individual, that young woman, but you're also influencing their parents, los tíos, the abuelas, and that is also an important part of the strategy. My hope is that Joe Biden goes bold, because I do think that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for a president to address the systemic infrastructure issues that we have, that COVID-19 has basically opened up worldwide for us to see, the disparities that exist.
And Mark, I mean, historically, from your research and the numbers that you've looked at, the people that you've polled, do Latinos feel like candidates and their campaigns are speaking directly to them? Do they feel heard, or do they feel like it's never enough?
Generally speaking, our research over the years has shown that Latinos feel that candidates aren't speaking to them, that they aren't reaching out to them, that they aren't generally hearing from candidates. But that will vary across the country. In some states, like, for example, Florida, you're less likely to see that because there is more voter outreach because of its battleground status in recent election cycles, compared to, say, a state like California, which has been a battleground or an important state in some primaries recently, but not necessarily at the national level in the national election in November. But it is a pattern that we see that many Hispanics tell us that they haven't heard from a candidate. If they have, it's usually the Democratic candidate who they hear from, but also that they feel the candidates don't quite listen to or don't quite communicate with them. And that's a pattern we've seen over the years in our polls at Pew Research.
And to Mark's point, one of the challenges is in the last two election cycles, both during the presidential and during the primary, 49% of registered Latino voters, Daisy, never received a contact from a campaign or from the candidate. 49%. Yet 79% of us still managed to go out and vote. And why? It's because of the work that grassroots organizations are doing, the conversations that Spanish-specific dominant coverage is happening to really talk about the importance of voting. And one of the reasons is this, and this is where the campaigns really need to change their strategy. They oftentimes say, well, we're only going to target high-frequency voters. By default, you're missing millions of newly naturalized voters that may have only voted once, and millions of young voters, not just Latinos, but young voters who are technically now officially the largest generation that we've ever witnessed in America. So the campaigns need to change their tactics, because this idea of only looking at someone with a history of voting leaves so many voters on the table for them.
And to give you some sense of how important that is, 25% of young Latinos in 2016 were first-time voters.
Yep.
And that's an important factor to keep in mind, is that how big this first-time voter segment of the Hispanic electorate is. It's oversized compared to other parts of the electorate.
That's right.
And for those joining us now, my name is Daisy Contreras. I'm an editor at The World, and I'm joined live here by María Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino, and Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Hispanic Research at the Pew Research Center. And we're taking questions from an audience, and one question from online, a question from Peter Ortiz on Facebook says, hi from Newark, New Jersey. How does the Latino vote look in the battleground states, and how likely are they to vote to make a difference in these states?
I would say that we have to take it state by state, and it has everything to do with how well resourced folks are going to be to make sure that we can reach those Latino voters. It's not legend, the fact that people have to pivot on how we've traditionally done the work, and most of the work is going to have to be online, and it has to be peer-to-peer with relational organizing. And by relational organizing, it means that Voto Latino, for example, since COVID, we have already created a volunteer base, about 400 folks, it's growing, but about 400 folks that have already texted over 170,000 voters on everything about how do you register for an absentee ballot, making sure that you have information to go to your primaries, making sure that you have a free ride to the polls because we have Lyft, but it's communication early now so that people understand, because the landscape is changing quickly. The House just passed the HEROES Act that included close to $3 billion to modernize our election system, including that allowing money so that states can implement vote by mail. That's a different experience for Latinos and African Americans. We have a tendency of wanting to physically see that piece of paper that we just checked off our candidates go into that voting booth and into that voting box. We have to start changing how we perceive our interaction with the electoral system, but we also have to be clear that in this process, every single state has to play by the exact same rules to ensure that there is not voter suppression.
Maria Teresa, I got one of those texts. Thank you.
You're welcome. We didn't plant it, by the way.
No. But I appreciate the texts and the reminders. It's always great. Thank you.
And another question from Facebook, and this kind of ties in what we've talked about so far. I mean, what do we know about what motivates 18-year-old Latino voters versus their parents? And there's some history here, right, Mark?
Yeah, so when we talk about the motivations for voting, of course, the issues are important in many ways. And sometimes the issues do vary from older Latinos to younger Latinos. But one of the interesting things about the Hispanic vote is that across the board, even though there may be some variations by age on an issue like, for example, gun rights, for the most part, the vast majority of Latinos want to see some sort of gun rights restrictions. And that's, I think, an important thing I think to keep in mind is that there is generally a unity in terms of viewpoints, though that's not always the case. So when it comes to voting and being motivated to vote, that can depend a lot on the issues. It can also depend on who you know. So for example, do you know somebody who's undocumented? You might have a very different point of view than if you don't know somebody who's undocumented about issues around immigration.
I think that's right. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing, as well as Mark pointed out, is that the motivation to go to the polls has everything to do with who is reaching out. And so the more that people create and construct campaigns of reaching out and meeting our voter where they are in unusual places, right? So if they are on YouTube, how do you actually reach them out on YouTube? If they are, before, if they were going to concerts, how do you reach them out? Because a voter in the Latino community does not wake up one day and say, oh, my life is really hard right now, I'm going to register to vote. No, they need to constantly remind them that the way they change the system is by their participation. And I think one of the things that does differentiate the Latino voter from other generations as a whole is that young Latinos really deeply feel a sense of responsibility of casting that ballot, especially if they have someone in their household who cannot. So there's still very much a sense of collective community, whereas when you poll, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you poll, for example, young white voters, it's very much an independent casting of that ballot.
That's correct. That's correct. Yes.
And Mark, earlier you mentioned that, who are these Latinos, right? Most of them will be Democrat, will vote Democrat, but that's not always the case. What has your research shown you about how Latinos generally vote?
So when you take a look at the Latino electorate, it is very diverse on a number of dimensions. And when it comes to voting, while the Democratic Party has long seen a larger share of Hispanic registered voters identify with or lean towards the Democratic Party, about 2/3, by the way, generally speaking. In some presidential elections, we've seen anywhere from 20% to up to 40% during George Bush's term voting for Republicans. Now, it does vary across the states. In some states like Florida, the share of Hispanics who vote Republican is different than what you'll see, say, in a state like California. But this only speaks to the diversity of the population. Not everybody's an immigrant. Not everybody's even the children of immigrant parents. And when we're talking about young Latinos, the majority are US born. About 90+% are born in the United States. So when we talk about this population, it's important to keep in mind that not everybody's a Spanish speaker. Not everybody only speaks English. It is diverse in a number of ways. And partisanship is one of those ways.
Right. And I think one of the things that at least we've discovered and the way we do our outreach is that it really depends on who the governor is and their state local officials on how Latinos react politically. So for example, in California, you see a whole bastion of liberalism, but that liberalism was ushered in because of Pete Wilson, who was the original grandfather of Show Me Your Paper laws. Before that point, Latinos didn't participate to their weight, but if they did, they were very much a pendulum. They were part of that swing state that California used to be. And what happened is that because all of a sudden Pete Wilson politicized being Latino, you saw a wave of people all of a sudden becoming blue and becoming registered Democrats. We've seen that trend most recently in Virginia. You've seen it in now Arizona. The best kept untold story was that Arizona went purple last year, but that was really because of Sheriff Arpaio. Colorado went purple and now blue because of Congressman Tancredo. You say now when you see the opportunity very much is aligned for that to mobilize a lot of Latinos who have historically been much more conservative is Texas, because Texas is home to 25% of all unregistered Latino youth in the country. And they have under Governor Abbott, some of the most stringent anti-immigration Show Me Your Paper laws under SB 4 that he signed 2 years ago. So there's a different type of mobilization that you would see in Texas than let's say in Florida, where the heat, so to speak, on the Latino community is lessened because you have people from so many different backgrounds from Latin America, but that they're not necessarily being racially profiled in the same manner as they are in these other states.
And speaking about access to voting, a question from Monica C. in San Francisco. How concerned are you about Latino access to the vote itself? I mean, we've heard stories about states wanting to push mail-in vote by mail. So is there a big concern that at the end of in November, we're not going to have that access?
We have to make sure that every single state is playing by the same rules when it comes to our federal elections. It's harder to set those rules for state elections, but for federal, we have to make sure that people are playing by the same rules. It can't be either or. It has to be, meaning that you either cast a ballot in person or vote by mail. You have to basically give the voter all the options so that they can exercise their vote. Voto Latino, we were very concerned of what happened in Wisconsin, where they were forced to hold an election and over 50 people who stood in line contracted COVID, and sadly, someone actually passed away. So we want to make sure that we have a healthy vote come November, and every single American, regardless of party, should be asking for that because we want maximum participation. And so the short answer is that we have to make sure that knows the information so that they can exercise that vote. But we have to hold our Republican and Democratic leaders accountable to make sure that they're safeguarding our elections.
And just to add some of the public opinion polling we did recently around COVID-19 and the upcoming November election, we found that Hispanic and Black voters particularly were concerned about there being some kind of a problem with the November election. So this is on the mind of Hispanic registered voters. It's a concern. And so it remains to be seen what will happen, but certainly it looks like things might change in how the election is administered. And that could have an impact on Latino voters in November.
So Voto Latino, we partnered with the NAACP. We just filed a lawsuit in Texas about over a week ago, specifically because in Texas, as an example, they don't allow you to have a vote by mail unless you're 65 years or older. Yesterday, the court ruled that they're going to allow people to vote by mail regardless, but we still have to, the devils are going to be in the details. And it's going to take the actions of organizations and of the American people to make sure that the ballot is cast properly, because it is disproportionately African-American and Latinos who have been the brunt of suppression laws that are acutely aware of the obstacles that already exist, and they have to be addressed sooner rather than later.
And speaking along the lines of access, another question from Facebook from Thomas Hernandez, what digital tools for civic engagement exist that can be promoted to Latinx communities?
Oh my goodness, I need you to go to votolatino.org and please become a volunteer. We have one of the most whip smart political operatives in the nation who leads all of our she's the national director of our work. Her name is Brianna Carmen. She hails from El Paso. She is one of the people, she was a campaign manager for Beto O'Rourke and ran his field operation during his Senate run. She's whip smart and an incredible leader. I would encourage you to basically sign up to volunteer, and we'll give you the breadth of tools that you need to make sure that you're enfranchised, but more importantly, your family and friends are.
And again, I'm Daisy Contreras. I'm an editor at The World. Thank you for joining us today at this Facebook Live. We're joined by María Teresa Kumar and Hugo Lopez. A few more questions because we only have about 5 more minutes left. So, I mean, Mark, in the beginning of this conversation, we talked about historically who is the Latino voter. I mean, when did we start seeing, or where, at what point did we know that the Latino population was going to be so young at this point? And were our candidates or presidential candidates or anybody running for office, should they have been aware of this long before this year?
Yeah, this trend and this pattern has been going on for decades. Back in 2000, we were already talking about the importance of births in the United States to Hispanic parents and how big the Latino youth component was going to be in the coming decades. So this has been something that's been underway since at least 2000, if not even earlier. And when you take a look at the future population projections of the country, you see the importance of Latino youth, because where would you see the future demographics of the country first? Among those, say, who are under age 5, among those who are kindergartners, among those who are ages 5 to 18. And we've been talking about this story nationally, both from the Census Bureau, Pew Research, just about everybody has been talking about this coming demographic change, and young Latinos have been at the forefront of that. So this has been ongoing for some time.
And
Daisy,
Voto
Latino, right? Go ahead.
Daisy, yeah, I mean, Daisy, the reason that Voto Latino started in 2004 was because we actually dusted off the 2000 census and said, oh, there's going to be a boom. We were not surprised by where we are today. And sadly, I will share with you, the vast majority of voter restriction laws were not either. The Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act was a decision under Shelby County versus Eric Holder. Shelby County had, during the 2010 census, experienced over 100% in a Latino population. Every single jurisdiction, there's roughly 22 jurisdictions that followed within a quick clip, less than 2 months, had all had a Latino population of at least 30 to 40%. And it wasn't that they were eligible to vote then, but that they were going to come of age in 2020. So while the Democratic Party has seen the same numbers, they didn't go spark into action of how to close this voter registration gap. It is shame on us as a country that 15 million Latinos are unregistered and 10 million of them are young people, because this shouldn't have surprised anybody. This was something that has been in its making, as Mark pointed out, for a long time. And Voto Latino, we started specifically because we read the tea leaves. I grew up in California under Pete Wilson. I understood really, heartfeltly what it meant to have great leadership, but also bad leadership that really put the Latino community with their backs against the wall, that really created fear. And it was those learnings of also understanding that young Latinos, they were steering their families through Pete Wilson's leadership, and it was, or lack of leadership, I should say. And so it wasn't for further discussion, but Voto Latino, for the first time, we endorsed Joe Biden, and we have never endorsed a political candidate in our lives, but it was because we recognize that right now the Latino community is feeling the brunt of an administration that has been not only been reckless with the health of the Latino community, but in some cases has physically endangered them with racial profiling programs, with denaturalization task force. So it is more of a shock when I feel, and I think, Mark, we've known each other for such a long time now, when I feel we have conversations that people are all of a sudden discovering the Latino community when we have been here the whole time. And one of the things that we're going to need is our friends and our allies to make sure that we are closing that voter registration gap, because our democracy's strength really depends on perfect participation, and we're far from that yet.
And as we talk about that, right, and look at what campaigns are doing, and in some of my reporting, I hear from organizations that are frustrated and say that candidates are not honest, or when they try to reach the Latino community, it's not very honest outreach. Very quickly, can you tell us what the Joe Biden campaign, how their Latino outreach is doing? Do you feel like they're doing enough right now, or have
Well, they brought in Julie Rodriguez, which is, she's a fantastic operative and really great strategist and deeply believes in the Latino community, but we can't be an afterthought. And I think that is what we have to leave your listeners to understand, is the Latino community cannot be an afterthought, because our sheer numbers and the issues that we care about are the ones that are going to help mobilize people and change the White House, if that is of a concern to you. And that is why we need to make sure that people modernize their policies. My biggest, one of the things I often hear is coming out of candidates is when you mention the Latino community, they immediately go and talk about immigration in Latin America. And I have to remind them that for many young people, Latin America is a folklore. It's their parents' story. They are rooted in this country. They are born in this country, and they want to make sure that they thrive and that the country thrives. Those are the conversations we need to have. It needs to be about education, about the economy, about their present future. And that oftentimes has been lost because the politicians and because campaigns have just simply not modernized.
And Mark, in your research also, do you see any feedback or any thoughts from the Latino communities that you poll on outreach?
So Latinos want to be reached out to, and they want to hear from candidates and from others as well. It's important to have those conversations. And if anything, our work over the years and the work at other places that I've worked at before suggests that it's important to have those conversations, to reach out and to talk, and that the opportunity is there. And I really think that that's what I find most interesting about the Hispanic population, is that there's so much opportunity when it comes to the vote, when it comes to youth, when it comes to the future of the United States, when it comes to their economic potential and their educational attainment. All those are aspects of the Latino population which speak to opportunity. And I think those opportunities are there, but it's going to require some work. This is not going to happen easily and overnight. This is something that's going to require a long, ongoing outreach to Latinos in a number of ways, including encouraging them to register and encouraging them to vote.
And to participate. And so if folks are interested in volunteering at Voto Latino, they could also text volunteer to 73179. Thank you, Herman, who does that for me. But it's going to take all of us. It's going to take these conversations. And oftentimes when people say, my vote doesn't matter, I remind people that people spend a lot of money in politics. And even though they write those checks, they still get up on that Tuesday in November to cast a ballot, because they recognize that the voting booth is our. So we need all of us, gente. We need to flex our muscles. It's not something that we deserve. We've earned it, and our families have earned this respect to make sure that we're properly represented.
And that's a great note to conclude our Facebook discussion about the young Latino vote. Thank you again, María Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino.
Thank you, Daisy.
And Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Hispanic Research at the Pew Research Center. The discussion comes to you with support from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and the World and PRX and WGBH. If you missed anything, you can view the full discussion at theworld.org. And let's keep the conversation going around these young Latino voters. Thank you so much.
Thanks for what you're doing, Daisy. Thank you.
Great, thank you.